Happy New Year! We are back again with On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMAPlay365. I'm your host Newsome, and we are here for the first time in 2021 as we enter the triple header at UFC Fight Island on Yas Island in Abu Dhabi. From Saturday we will see 3 events at Fight Island in the space of 7 days, including the return of the notorious Conor McGregor on January 23rd. But for this episode, of course, we'll be focusing on Max Holloway versus Calvin Kattar, which is a phenomenal fight in the UFC featherweight division. The event will also start early too, which is great for us in the UK and Europe. The prelims will start at 5 PM UK time, which means a 12 PM start Eastern time. Obviously, these times are subject to change, so don't come at me if they are changed between now and Saturday. But just before we get into the breakdowns, a couple of things to mention in regards to MMAPlay365. Firstly, we have restructured our pricing for 2021. We're going to be providing free content for every single UFC event, as our dog of the week will be free to anybody that wants to grab it. A next event subscription is now only $4.99. Our monthly subscription is just $9.99, and our yearly price is a crazy $99.99. For a handicapper myself that has won 4 years in a row now, tracked and verified online, you'll do well to beat those prices. We give you written breakdowns, recommended bets, official bets, parlays, parlay pieces, and a winning handicapper on your side. Even heading into 2021, I've only lost one event in the last 15, which dates back to September 2020. The form is solid, and I look to roll into 2021 how I left 2020. To sign up, please go and visit MMAPlay365.com. And with that out the way, let's go. Let's break down some fights. In the main event, we've got a phenomenal one between Max Holloway versus Calvin Kattar in the UFC featherweight division. Max Holloway is currently minus 150. The comeback on Calvin Kattar at plus 130 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with Kattar at plus 130. I think the line is still quite wide. Kattar has come down though. He was at plus 170, plus 175 in some spots, so all that money's coming on Kattar, and I do agree with it. I do think that this fight should be closer to a pick'em, which might surprise some people, but I'll explain why very soon. As for where the betting line moves, like I've already mentioned, all the money's been coming in on Kattar. There's been the occasional kickback from Max Holloway bettors, but ultimately that line has come down and closed quite a lot, and I do expect that trend to continue. I think Kattar will enter the fight plus 110, plus 120 come fight night on Saturday night. But as for how this fight plays out, first and foremost, looking at the wrestling and grappling, I think we're going to see minimal amounts of that. If any fighter is likely going to be trying to shoot takedowns, I would say it's on Kattar's side, but taking Max Holloway down is near impossible, and keeping him down is even tougher than taking him down, so I don't think that that's going to be a factor. On the flip side for Holloway, trying to take Kattar down, I just really don't see it. If there is any wrestling or grappling in this fight, I just don't see it being enough to make this fight won and lost in those departments. The fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. It's predominantly going to take place on the feet, and it's who is the fighter that's going to land that more volume, going to land the more effective strikes, and that's where the fight gets really interesting, because from Max Holloway's perspective, I don't think his strikes are super technical, especially when you compare him to Calvin Kattar. I think when you're looking at striking technique, the boxing, the hands, the combinations, I think Kattar is the better boxer and the better striker in regards to that technique. But in regards to volume, that's where Max Holloway shines, and for any fighter that beats Max Holloway, they must have an answer for that volume. As an opponent of Max Holloway, you can't just stand there and allow Holloway to pour volume on you, because although Holloway doesn't possess that one-punch knockout power, what he'll do is he'll accumulate his strikes. He'll land 100, 130, 140, 150, even more strikes on you if that's how you allow the fight to play out, and every strike that lands will just be accumulated, and eventually he'll bust you up, he'll draw blood, he'll start making a mess of your face, and ultimately that will play a part in the fight. It'll make a fighter's gas tank drain, it will hurt a fighter, and ultimately just look great in the judge's eyes, so you can't allow for that to happen. Now, the good news for Calvin Kattar is that Holloway is actually hittable himself. So sure, he pumps out 100 plus strikes in pretty much every fight, but he also gets hit 100 plus times back. You look at his last 2 fights against Volkanovski. Volkanovski landed 137 last time out. The fight before that was 157. And he actually out-volumed Max Holloway in both of those fights as well. The fight before those Volkanovski fights, Frankie Edgar, 96 strikes, wasn't quite 100, but Frankie Edgar managed to land a significant amount of strikes on him. Dustin Poirier landed 178 on him. And even Ortega, as bad as that fight was, Holloway completely demolished him, he still landed 110 strikes in 4 rounds against him. So Holloway is hittable. For sure he loves volume, but he will get into wars where he'll give one to take one, and I don't think that's the type of fight that he should be fighting with Calvin Kattar. Now, the one question mark that we would have had before Kattar's last fight against Dan Ige, is Kattar capable of landing 100 plus strikes himself in a fight? It's not easy to do, especially when you're not used to 5 rounders, but Kattar did hit that 100 plus strikes barrier in that Dan Ige fight, so we know that Kattar's capable of applying that volume over 25 minutes. This fight with Max Holloway is really interesting because you've got Holloway that is a natural 5-rounder, a cardio machine. In fact, he comes on better later in fights, and he will pump out volume, absolutely. But the thing is, because he gets hit so much, and we saw this in the Poirier fight, Poirier was probably one of the hardest punchers that Holloway's fought recently, and Dustin Poirier was landing hard shots on him. He was hurting Max, he was rocking Max, and Max Holloway actually absorbs a lot of damage. He's really durable, but at some point that's going to crack. I'm not saying it's going to be this fight, but what I'm saying is when you look at what Max Holloway was like facing somebody that does have power in the hands, he was getting hurt and he lost rounds because of it. And I see the same thing happening in this fight with Calvin Kattar. Calvin Kattar is a good boxer. He hits hard, he hits in combinations, he goes to the body and head. The other thing that I like for Kattar in this fight is that he matches Max Holloway from a physical perspective in regards to height, reach, and length. Max Holloway has fought a lot of guys in the featherweight division that he just has a huge height and reach advantage over, and that does allow him to sit on the outside, firing straight punches inside, and ultimately just being able to stay relatively safe on the outside, but still rack up that volume, still accumulate those strikes. But in this fight, he's not going to have those height or reach advantages against Kattar, and when Holloway comes into exchange, when he's into punching range and landing punches, then Kattar's also going to be in that range as well. It's not as if Kattar's got to push further into the range to land his strikes. Kattar's going to be right there as well. And I just feel that the speed, the technique, the power in Kattar's boxing is going to really cause problems for Holloway. I actually think Holloway might land more volume in this fight, but I think that Kattar's going to be landing the bigger action strikes. I think Kattar's going to be the one visibly hurting Holloway. I think Holloway is going to get rocked in this fight. I'm not saying he's going to get knocked out because he is super durable, but I do think that the judges are going to see Holloway hurt multiple occasions in this fight. It'll only take Kattar to rock Holloway once badly or even drop him in a round for that round to be scored to Kattar. And again, Holloway doesn't get dropped very easily either, but if he's getting hurt, it's going to be noticeable, it's going to be visible, and I do think that that favours Kattar should this fight go 5 rounds. If it doesn't go 5 rounds, if there is a finish, then I would think that Kattar is the more likely fighter to find the finish in this fight, which also makes me favour him a little bit more in this fight as well. Kattar can win a 5-round decision based on those bigger action strikes. I do think he'll be slightly behind on the volume, so he does need those big action strikes. And if there is a finish, I think that's more likely to be Kattar as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Calvin Kattar to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, we've got a battle of the veterans. We've got Carlos Condit versus Matt Brown. Carlos Condit's currently the -160 favourite. The comeback on Brown at +140 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I think the value absolutely sits with Matt Brown as the underdog at +140. I think the line's too wide. I think it should be much closer to a pick'em as well. As for where the betting line moves, this is only going to go so wide before money starts coming in on Matt Brown and bringing it back in. I think it's already gone too wide, so at some point soon, I am expecting that line to close up quite a lot. And I think come Saturday, come fight night, I think we will see Matt Brown maybe at +10, +115, potentially even shorter than that. I don't think he should be out at +140 at all. As for how the fight plays out, as I've already mentioned, both fighters are veterans. They've been around the game a very long time, and it really does make for an interesting fight here. We've got Carlos Condit, who is a lifelong striker. He's always had that problem of defending takedowns in his career. So this is potentially a path to victory for Matt Brown, in my opinion. If Matt Brown does want to try and get this fight down, I do think he'll be able to get Carlos Condit down. And Matt Brown's jiu-jitsu is so underrated. I think if Brown can get on top of Condit, I think he can cause him problems, ground and pound submission attempts. I think if Condit tries to get back to his feet, Matt Brown could potentially suffocate him, drag him back down and continue to work on top. But that's if Brown has that game plan, which, as I said in Condit and Court McGee's fight, when I broke that down, the reason that I couldn't trust Court McGee in that fight was because I didn't trust him to shoot the takedowns, and he didn't. Court McGee's a wrestler, and he ended up getting beat on the feet by the better striker. Now, I'm not saying that Carlos Condit is absolutely the better striker in this fight. I think his technique is better. I think Matt Brown's more dangerous. So for me, it really wouldn't shock me if the takedowns and the wrestling just wasn't in the mind of Matt Brown at all. I think Brown's going to go to war in this fight. I think he's prepared to take some shots, to close that distance, to get in the face of Condit and to try and finish him. And actually, I don't mind that game plan either. I think that Condit has shown problems in the past of facing super aggressive fighters, coming forward, trying to get into the face of him. It really just does block that striking technique that Condit has, that striking technique advantage that he usually has over his opponent. And if Brown can get into that clinch distance, if he can tie up with him, if he can land those elbows against the cage and really start cutting Condit up, then that's another path to victory. I do think the wrestling is going to be the easiest path. Like I say, notoriously throughout Condit's career, his one biggest problem has been defending takedowns and being able to stop a grappling heavy approach. So if Brown does go down that route, I think that's a straightforward victory for him, because I do think he'll be able to get him down, and I do think he'll roll on Condit on the mat. But if he doesn't, if he decides to strike with Condit, it'll make his life a little bit trickier because Condit is a good striker, but ultimately I do think he'll be able to find the shots to hurt Condit. And when you look at Matt Brown's last fight, he fought Miguel Baeza, who is an absolute beast right now. He's a young, explosive prospect, and Matt Brown had Baeza in some trouble early in that fight. So if he's able to put on that type of performance early on against Miguel Baeza, then he's absolutely capable of doing it against Carlos Condit. I do think that Condit could potentially win this fight if he sticks on the outside. Remember, it's the bigger cage in Fight Island. If he really just is on his bike the entire fight, counter-striking, fighting on the back foot, Condit's capable of doing that, and that's how he does win that fight. Condit has to make sure that that distance is kept for the majority of this fight. Even if he drops around, fine, get that round out of the way, but make sure for at least 2 of these rounds that distance is kept and that he's just pumped a little bit of volume onto Matt Brown, got Matt Brown frustrated, causing Matt Brown to try and bull rush in, making mistakes. That should allow Condit to run away with the fight a little bit, but honestly, I think that's going to be easier said than done against Brown. Brown has spent a career of being aggressive, closing the distance, getting inside, landing dirty boxing, landing elbows inside the clinch, getting takedowns, working on the mat, working his jiu-jitsu. So I do think that he's got multiple paths to victory here, that he can take it either way. And for those reasons, I'm picking Matt Brown to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the return of Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Jingliang Li. Ponzinibbio is currently the minus 290 favourite to come back on Li at plus 245 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that there's minimal value on Ponzinibbio. The line's fair. It probably could be into the minus 300s, which it is at some other books. But yeah, the line's fair. Minimal value on Ponzinibbio. I get it for sure. As for where the betting line moves, it wouldn't shock me to see all the books fulfill that minus 300 range. If it went to minus 320, minus 330, then again I'd understand, and I do think that the line heads in that direction the closer we get to fight night on Saturday night. As for how the fight plays out, obviously the big red flag in this fight is the fact that this is Ponzinibbio's first fight for over 2 years. He's been sidelined with injuries, health problems, all that sort of stuff. So unfortunate, because Ponzinibbio was on a phenomenal run in the welterweight division and unfortunately had to be sidelined for the last 2 years. So coming back after injury, coming back after the layoff, there is some concerns there. Is there going to be some ring rust? Some believe in it, some don't. But it's going to be really interesting to see how he looks on the night. Ultimately, I think even if he is a slightly worse version of himself 2 years ago. I still think it's going to be enough to beat Li Jingliang. Stylistically, I think the fight favours Ponzinibbio a lot. He's not going to have to deal with anybody who's going to look to over wrestle him or look to try and get him to the mat frequently. It wouldn't shock me if Lee did try and shoot a couple of takedowns against Ponzinibbio, try to get him down. Lee does have takedowns in his back pocket, but ultimately Lee is a fighter that does like to stay on the feet, stand and bang, and ultimately that's where he has the most success in the fights that he wins. In this fight, though, I feel that when these two guys come together on the feet, I think that Lee might potentially be the faster fighter. I'm not too sure. Again, it depends how Ponzinibbio looks, but I think Ponzinibbio's technique and how hard he cracks are going to be huge advantages for him in this fight. And ultimately, I do think that this fight is going to be won and lost on the feet. So although they're both aggressive, I do feel that once they meet in the middle and they start throwing down, I do think that one fighter is going to start taking that step backwards because of that aggression and power that they've just felt coming back at them. And I feel that that fight is going to be Jingliang Li. I think once he starts moving backwards, Ponzinibbio will grow into the fight. Again, it could be a really sketchy start for Ponzinibbio in that first round, just getting that feeling back into the cage after the layoff, after the time off. So I think Ponzinibbio is going to be growing into this fight the longer it goes on. And I feel the style, the aggression that Jingliang Li likes to fight at, I think is going to present him with problems, because that's going to in turn present Ponzinibbio with a lot of opportunities to crack him. I think Ponzinibbio is going to land more volume in this fight. I think he's probably going to be the one that lands the more damage with the harder shots, the bigger action strikes, and I do think he's the more likely fighter out of the two to find a finish. So for all those reasons, I'm picking Santiago Ponzinibbio to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Joaquin Buckley versus Alessio Di Chirico. Buckley's currently minus 265 with the comeback on Di Chirico at plus 225 as the underdog. Now, as for where the value is on this betting line, I do think it sits slightly with Di Chirico, the underdog. I think the line's too wide. I think there's a lot of hype baked into that line. I don't think people are as high on Di Chirico as maybe they once were. So again, I feel that's a factor in the betting line as well. And ultimately, I do think that it should be shorter. So for me, the value would be on Di Chirico out of the two. As for where the betting line moves, it does look like it's trending a little bit with money coming in on Di Chirico, but nothing major. It's just moving very steadily right now. But I do feel that this trend might continue in the lead up to the fight on Saturday night, and we might see Joaquin Buckley go inside the cage on Saturday night, minus 240, maybe minus 245. As for how this fight plays out, though, I do think that if Joaquin Buckley doesn't knock Di Chirico out, that this fight could get relatively close. From a technique perspective, Di Chirico is quite a fundamentally sound fighter. He doesn't make too many mistakes. He's always game. He'll always try and put up the volume. He'll put power behind his strikes as well. His cardio, he can go 3 rounds. Of course, he does slow down like many fighters do, but, you know, no known gas tank issues from my perspective anyway. I think the worry for Di Chirico in this fight is the power that Buckley packs in his punches, because Di Chirico can be hit. He has been hurt in the past as well, and I do think that Buckley's got a speed advantage on the feet also. For Di Chirico, for me, I'll be trying to close the distance, get past that boxing range that nullifies the power of Buckley, clinch up with him. But again, Buckley's strong, so that's going to be a bit of a risk. But just trying to trip Buckley down to the mat and get on top of him. For me, that'd be the game plan for Di Chirico, because if he stands at range with Buckley, then he runs that risk of the knockout. But if Di Chirico eats some early big shots from Buckley and doesn't get put out, it's going to be one of those scenarios where one fighter has felt the big power from his opponent, the power puncher, and then that allows that fighter to grow into the fight a little bit more. Now he knows that he's taken the best that his opponent can give him. And if that happens in this fight, again, that's where I see it being close. I ultimately think, though, that the speed on the feet of Buckley is going to be enough to catch Di Chirico with a big shot and put him out, though. I think that Di Chirico won't come into this fight looking to close the distance straight away. I think he'll try and find his feet with his striking, look to throw a jab out, use his fundamentals to really get his reads in before he starts making his own moves in the fight towards the game plan. But by that point, I think Buckley's going to be landing on him. Buckley comes out fast, he comes out hard, and I do think that he's going to find something to land on Chirico. Even if he doesn't knock him out cold, I think he could hurt him, which could affect Chirico for the remainder of the fight. Even if Buckley was unable to get him out, I think if he hurts him early, he could make him hesitant. He will know that he's already been hurt. It'll affect his game, it'll affect his performance, and Buckley could then win a decision. So I do feel that the speed, the power, and the athleticism of Joaquin Buckley is going to be enough in this fight. I'm picking Joaquin Buckley to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Punahele Soriano versus Dusko Todorovic. Todorovic is currently the -155 favourite. The comeback on Soriano at +135 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with Todorovic at -155. I do think that there's an argument he could be -160, -165, maybe even -170. So at -155, I do think there's value on him. As for where the betting line moves, I actually think that this line closes up. I think a lot of people like Soriano. I think people like that he's got the wrestling background, he's got power in his hands, and he can put his opponents out. Also, there is some stylistic issues from Todorovic's side, which I will touch upon soon, that I do feel that some people might favour. So I think the betting line is going to shorten up a little bit the closer we get to fight night, and it wouldn't surprise me to see Todorovic enter the cage -130, maybe even -135. So as for how this fight plays out, I've already mentioned Punahele Soriano has got that wrestling background, he's got decent boxing, he's got power in his hands, he will look to come forward and let his hands go, and if he does clip the chin of his opponent, then they are going to get hurt, or they are going to go down, or they are going to get knocked out. He's a really fun fighter to watch. And also what I do like about Soriano is he will mix in his wrestling with his striking as well, so he won't always stick to one or the other. He'll mix things up really well inside the cage, and again, that's just a really good trait to have because it can create confusion for your opponent in regards to not knowing what's coming next, what's actually in your game plan, and ultimately make them struggle to read you. So it's a good trait to have for sure. Now on the flip side with Todorovic is a fighter that's also quite well-rounded. He's a guy that looks like he has good striking, good kickboxing, but ultimately he's big and he's strong and he likes to close the distance, clinch up, tie up with his opponent, push their backs to the cage, work them against the cage. If a takedown's there, then great. He'll try and level change and take them down against the cage. But if the takedowns aren't there, he doesn't care. He'll stay inside the clinch. He'll look to land dirty boxing, elbows inside the clinch, and ultimately just really suffocate his opponent. And when they try and escape in reverse position, he just has a burst of strength himself and he'll push them back against the cage. And what he'll be doing is he'll be hurting his opponents just a little bit, busting them up just a little bit, just working enough for a referee not to split him up against the cage. And that's really good for Dusko Todorovic in this fight because he is going to be the slightly bigger fighter, he is going to be the stronger fighter. And actually, if you go back into Todorovic's career, you'll see that he fought Michel Pereira. In that fight, he looked like he matched Pereira in regards to strength. He couldn't really hold Pereira for too long, but he's a big strong dude himself. I do feel in this fight against Soriano, he is going to have some success here in doing that. And for as long as this fight is against the cage with Dusko Todorovic pushing Soriano's back against it and working on him, it takes away that chance of Soriano landing a big hard shot on the chin of Todorovic and knocking him out, and it also prevents Soriano from getting his wrestling game going. So this to me really does tell me that stylistically the fight is going to favour Todorovic as long as he gets that game plan going of, you know, a clinch heavy pressure game plan. The one worry that I have for Todorovic in this fight, and actually it's quite a big worry, I touched upon it at the start of this breakdown as well, and that's defensively striking. If you bet Todorovic in this fight, he is going to make you sweat in regards to how he defends strikes. His hands are down, he loves to use head movement, leaning back, swaying left and right and just trying to dodge punches, and I guarantee at some point in his career a fighter is going to catch him and make him pay for those decisions, because you've got to keep your hands up. You cannot rely on yourself being able to see all the strikes coming enough and in enough time to be able to move out of the way of them with just head movement. You've got to have your hands up, so that's definitely a concern, especially with how hard Soriano strikes. And moving back onto Soriano, the ways that I see him winning this fight is if he can put on a wrestling clinic against Todorovic. I don't think he'll be able to keep him down for extended periods of time, especially early on in this fight, but if that relentless wrestling continues throughout the rounds, then we could see it getting a little bit easier the longer the fight goes on. The thing is, I don't think Soriano's got the cardio to do that, and I'm not saying he's a complete gas job because he's not. I just feel that he does slow down in his fights, and as the pace picks up at the end of round 1, he comes into round 2 and he's looking a little bit slower. I just don't think he can provide that wrestling clinic in that path to victory. The other path to victory is keeping the fight at distance early on and landing something that knocks Todorovic out, which again is possible, especially as I've already mentioned with the strike and defense of Todorovic. But ultimately I see the game plan of closing the distance for Todorovic, getting Soriano's back against the cage and grinding him out as being the most likely path to victory out of the two fighters and out of the path to victories that they've got. I do think that Todorovic can get Soriano tired. If he does get him tired later in the fight, I think Todorovic's cardio will hold up more than Soriano's. I do think he could then potentially score his own takedowns as well. So I think as long as Todorovic puts a heavy pace and pressure on Soriano, uses height, uses strength advantage, and really try and drain that gas tank a little bit in that first round, it should make the fight a little easier for him the longer it goes on. So for those reasons, I'm picking Dusko Todorovic to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Nassourdine Imavov versus Phil Hawes. Phil Hawes is currently the -140 favourite. The comeback on Imavov at +120 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think there's slight value with Imavov at +120. He was a much bigger underdog earlier this year, shall we say, and towards the end of last year he was looking +140, +150 in some spots, so a lot of money has come in on Imavov, and I do agree with that line movement for sure, but I feel that if this gets much closer to a pick-em, it could be one of those fights where the value then flips onto his opponent, and in this case Phil Hawes. But for now, there's value on Imavov at +120. As for where this betting line moves, I do think that it'll continue to close up, and it wouldn't shock me if these fighters went into the fight on Saturday night as a -110 pick'em on either side. As for how this fight plays out though, I think that the longer the fight goes on, the more it favours Imavov, and ultimately that's why I do think there's value on him for sure, because if he cannot get himself knocked out in that first round or get taken down, get into a bad position and allow Phil Hawes to score a finish on the mat, then I do think that the fight favours him the longer it goes on. It's just that first round is going to be really, really sketchy for Imavov, because Phil Hawes does have good wrestling. He will be shooting takedowns. He will be trying to land a big knockout shot. We saw what he did on his UFC debut last time out. He's got big power. He's got raw athleticism, and he'll come out fast and hard. So I'm sure he will want to replicate that last performance in this fight as well. If he can go out there and score another huge knockout, that's a potential 50k bonus for him. That's further hype on his name, and that's the sort of performances that he wants. So I've got no doubts that Phil Hawes is going to come out fast and hard in this fight. If he can't get a big knockout, or if he does land a couple and he doesn't look to wobble Imavov, then he'll probably go to his wrestling. But I think that if this fight gets out of the first round, that's when it starts becoming a potential fight for Imavov to take over, because Phil Hawes does have gas tank issues. We have seen it before. He starts fast, he starts hard, he looks to wrestle, he looks to try and land bombs, but ultimately he doesn't have the cardio to hold that through 15 minutes. And I'm not saying he comes directly into round 2 looking completely gassed, hands on hips, can't perform. It's just he starts to tire quite a lot. So if this fight was to go 3 rounds, I'd expect Hawes to win round 1. I'd expect Imavov to win round 3, and then it's all about at what point Imavov takes over that round 2, so it could get a little sketchy there. For me, I think Imavov can absolutely win a decision. I think he can survive that first round and take a decision, and ultimately if Phil Hawes does not take Imavov out in that first round, I do think that Imavov will go on to win the fight, whether that be finishing him late due to how fatigued Hawes may be, or whether that just be outpointing him to a decision. I think both are possible outcomes. I'm picking Nassourdine Imavov to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Yanan Wu versus the newcomer, Joselyne Edwards. Yanan Wu is currently the -140 favourite. The comeback on Edwards at +120 as the underdog. And as for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Edwards. I know she's the newcomer, I know it's short notice, but at +120, I definitely feel that she has some value. And it's pretty crazy that she opened up at +205 as well. So that's nuts, and rightfully so. All the money has come in on Edwards to this point. And as for where the betting line moves, I do think we're going to see a little bit more money coming back in on Edwards, but at some point I definitely think that we'll see some Wu money coming back in for sure as well. And it wouldn't surprise me if the fighters went in on Saturday night roughly where they're at right about now. And as for how the fight plays out, Joselyne Edwards, for those that aren't familiar with her, after watching tape, she does look like a striker. She's a fighter that loves to be aggressive on the feet, comes forward, throws in combinations, will mix in punches with kicks. She'll kick to the legs, and she will look to strike to the body and head as well, so she really doesn't discriminate. Ultimately, she just likes to remain busy and keep that activity up, which is always something that I like to see from a fighter. The one thing I haven't seen too much of is Edwards being pushed back herself, someone being aggressive with her, pushing her back, how she fights on the back foot. And it really does matter, because there's a big difference between striking going forwards and striking moving backwards. And in this fight against Yanan Wu, there is going to be moments where she is going to have to be moving backwards, so it's going to be really interesting to see how she deals with that. Yanan Wu is a fighter that likes to be aggressive herself. She's very physical, very strong. She's got good straight punches, and she likes to come forward herself. The straight punches down the barrel, again, that's her volume, that's her activity. But the one issue that I have with Wu coming forward doing that is she doesn't really move her head off the centre line much, so that in turn makes her quite hittable. And I think that's something that Edwards can exploit in this fight and should exploit in this fight. And I feel that when Wu is coming forward, trying to be aggressive herself and trying to use her physique and her strength to bully Edwards a little bit, I think she's going to leave herself open for Edwards to start catching her. And Edwards looks like she's got a little bit of sting behind her shots as well, so it wouldn't shock me to see her light Wu up a little bit, and that might make Wu a little hesitant. It might make her start moving backwards herself, and then that's Edwards' game at that point. What's going to be interesting to me in this fight is when they clinch up, if Wu can push her back and hold her against the cage, because that's where Wu's had a lot of success in the past. Like I've said already, just using her physical advantages and just being able to hold her opponent against the cage, land short shots on them, and just do enough to stop the referee from trying to split them up. So Edwards has got to be really careful from that perspective. Also, Edwards can be taken down as well. It's not necessarily easy to take her down, but if you can get her down a couple of times, get her flat on her back, then you can really start to look for the top side grappling and spending a little bit of time on top of her. And again, that's the worry for Edwards. Ultimately, I just think this is going to be quite a close fight. It's going to be really interesting to see which game plan comes out on top. I don't think that Edwards is one of the smaller fighters that is going to get bullied by Wu. I definitely think she's going to be able to fire back in that respect. And in regards to the striking, accuracy, technique and volume, I'd give those advantages to Edwards. So for those reasons, I'm picking Joselyne Edwards to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a good fight at middleweight. I'm not sure why it's buried this far into the prelims, but a great fight. We've got Omari Akhmedov versus Tom Breeze. Tom Breeze is currently the -150 favourite. The comeback on Akhmedov at +130 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with Tom Breeze. And to be honest, I wouldn't have been shocked if he was up at -160, -170 either. As for where the line moves, I actually think we see some money coming in on Akhmedov. I think that at +130, a UFC veteran who happens to be a tough Dagestani-born Russian is definitely going to see some betting tickets come in on him. So I wouldn't be shocked to see Tom Breeze go into the fight at -130, maybe -135, with Akhmedov down at +115, +120. As for how the fight plays out though, it's a really interesting fight stylistically, because you've got Tom Breeze, who is definitely the better striker. As a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, he's going to be the better grappler, but the wrestling is absolutely over towards Akhmedov, so that's going to make the fight really interesting. While it's on the feet, with the exchanges, I do think that Tom Breeze is going to start lighting Akhmedov up. I do think that there's a big gap in skill on the feet. The jab from Breeze is really educated, his boxing again really educated. He's been working with Anthony Joshua this camp as well, so that to me is only going to sharpen the tools of his boxing. But then he's got his low kicks, his body kicks. He really does put it together really well on the feet, and he's really fluid when he starts getting into his flow. When he's got his reads down and he starts striking, he is really nice to watch. But there's going to be more to this fight than just the stand-up side of it, because Akhmedov's obviously got his wrestling and he does implement takedowns into his game plan, but if he is getting beaten on the feet very noticeably, then I think that wrestling is going to come out much stronger and much more relentless. I do think that Akhmedov can take Tom Breeze down. In fact, I don't think there's many fighters that Akhmedov would actually struggle to take down in the UFC. His entries are really on point. His chain wrestling is decent. He is relentless when he wants to get the takedown. He'll drive through if his opponent defends the initial entry, push his opponent back to the cage and look to drag him down to the mat any way that he can. His wrestling is good, but there's a big difference between wrestling and grappling. So obviously once Akhmedov's got the fight to the mat, then the grappling kicks in, and that's where Tom Breeze is better. So I think Breeze is a lot more active when he's taken down than what we saw against Brendan Allen. The difference in that fight with Brendan Allen is he's just a really good grappler as well. So when the fight hit the mat and Breeze tried to work his jiu-jitsu, he was also coming up against another Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt, and that's what made Allen really comfortable on top. Whereas with Omari Akhmedov, if Breeze goes to stand up, he's got no problem showing his back, because Akhmedov isn't really going to jump his back and, look to take the back and look for a rear naked choke. That's not really his style. He will allow Breeze up, keep a hold of him, and then try and drag him back down. So for me, Breeze has got the advantages in the grappling department to A, remain safe if he's taken down, and B, try and find his way back up to his feet. It's just he's got to keep defending the reshots from Akhmedov. In my opinion though, if Akhmedov keeps trying to take him down, Breeze has definitely got the better cardio. Akhmedov will tire. Akhmedov in some fights tires, in other fights he doesn't. And one reason for that is the wrestling. When he's comfortable in the stand-up and when he can dictate the pace of the fight on the feet and look for takedowns and get them comfortably, he's not being made to work, and therefore his cardio will last 3 rounds. But when he is made to work, and you saw that in the Chris Weidman fight last time out, Akhmedov was made to work in the jiu-jitsu department. Ultimately, he gassed out that bad in round 3 that he lost the fight, and bear in mind he just won round 2 as well. So that to me is a clear sign that when Akhmedov is overly wrestling, he will get tired. And for me, for Akhmedov to win this fight, he's not only got to get Breeze down, but he's got to keep him down for long periods on the mat to be able to win the rounds via top control. If Breeze keeps getting back up to his feet and Akhmedov continues with the takedowns, at some point we're going to see a change in direction in this fight. We're going to see Breeze taking over because Akhmedov will naturally tire. So for me, it's a really interesting fight here. Stylistically, with Breeze being the better striker, likely going to be the better grappler, but not the better wrestler, it really does make for an interesting fight. And the bottom line is it comes down to Omari Akhmedov. Can Akhmedov take Breeze down, keep him down, and get some good top control time in for 2 out of the 3 rounds? I don't think he can. I think that he will get Breeze down, definitely, but I do think Breeze will find his way back up to his feet. I think Breeze will do the better work on the feet in the striking realm than what Akhmedov does in regards to wrestling and top control. And for that reason, I'm picking Tom Breeze to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the big lads. We've got Justin Tafa versus Carlos Felipe. Carlos Felipe is currently the -185 favourite, with the comeback on Tafa at +160 as the underdog. Now, as for where the value lies on this betting line, I do think the value's with the underdog in Justin Tafa at +160. I definitely think the line should be closer. I do think stylistically it could be quite a close fight, and with them being hard-hitting heavyweights, all it takes is one punch to go out. So for me, the lines are a little bit too wide. I think they should be shorter, and for me that leaves value on the underdog. Now, as for where this betting line moves, I do think that the betting lines will close a little bit come fight night on Saturday night. I don't think it'll close too much. At the minute, it does seem to be money coming in on Felipe at -185, so it is going to be interesting to see where the betting line does actually close. But I think Justin Tafa will go in at +150 on Saturday night, with Carlos Felipe around -175. Now, as for how the fight plays out, stylistically it's a great fight. I think it's going to be won and lost on their feet. Both fighters like to be aggressive, they like to come forward, they like to land big, hard bombs, and they're both quite aggressive as well, specifically Carlos Felipe, and this is what seems to edge me over to Justin Tafa, because when fighters are really aggressive with him, it's that counter left hand or the big right hand as his opponent is coming in on him that tends to really put fighters out, lands really hard. So Felipe's got to be careful that he's not overly aggressive in this fight, but it seems to be in his DNA. That's how he likes to come out in his fights, to be aggressive, to get in the face of his opponents. I just don't think that getting in the face of Justin Tafa and being aggressive is going to end up too well for him on the night. Now, one catalyst to this fight that I would find very interesting is if Felipe looks to take Tafa down, because Tafa does seem to be, you know, a whole striker. He loves the striking game, but if he's put on his back, I don't know how effective he is. And Carlos Felipe does have takedowns in his locker. He likes to get the body lock. So if he closes the distance against Tafa, gets his arms wrapped around him, looks to drag him or trip him to the mat, or even double leg him, I do think that he'd be able to take Tafa down. And on top, I'm not sure what Tafa would have to offer Carlos Felipe. I think Felipe would look good in top control. I think he'd land some nice ground and pound. I think he'd be able to advance position. So for me, the clear path to victory for Felipe would be to take Tafa down and really work on him on top. And if he can do that in round one and really put that good work in, then it will probably tire Tafa as well, because Tafa is a striker and he won't be used to grappling to that extent enough for his gas tank to hold up, especially in a 3-round heavyweight fight. So for me, Carlos Felipe has that huge advantage there, but I think Felipe is that type of fighter that just loves to have fun in there and loves nothing more than to put his opponent unconscious with a big punch. If that's his game plan, I do favour Tafa to win this fight, even though he's got a clear path to victory in my opinion if he's to take Tafa down. Ultimately, I think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. I think someone's going to land something that puts their opponent out, and I'm picking Justin Tafa to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got David Zawada versus Ramazan Emeev. Emeev is currently the -260 favourite. The comeback on Zawada at +220 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I don't think there's too much value, to be honest. I totally understand why Emeev is at -260. I do think he warrants that betting line, and if Emeev was down at -220 or -225, I think there'd be so much value on him that that betting line just wouldn't last long anyway. So at -260, I agree with it. As for where the betting lines move, I do think we're going to see some fluctuation here. I do think we could see Emeev go to -280, -290, maybe even -300, but I think at that point we will see the money coming back in on Zawada. So for me, I think that Ramazan Emeev is going to enter the cage around -275 come fight night on Saturday night. Now, as for how this fight plays out, it's going to be really interesting, and it's really down to Emeev to set the pace and to decide where he wants to take this fight, and ultimately it's going to be down to Emeev on who actually gets the win on the night, because I think Zawada is going to want to strike. He's a very elusive, very crazy striker with a ton of volume, ton of power, ton of aggression. He's really fun to watch. I think if Emeev doesn't try and take this fight down to the mat, I think he's going to get hit way too much by Zawada. He's going to give Zawada plenty of opportunities to finish him, and ultimately I think he's going to be a step behind on the feet. I think the array of strikes that Zawada throws inside the cage, the aggression and the speed that comes with it will be enough to overwhelm Emeev, but that's only one side of the fight. I think Emeev is going to want to try and close the distance and get this fight to the mat. Basically, with Zawada's game, it is all about volume, aggression, and just throwing a ton of crazy strikes at his opponents and just really being fun to watch. The way to nullify that is by closing the distance, getting tied up with that fighter and trying to drag them down to the mat, because you nullify the strengths, and ultimately if you're Ramazan Emeev, that's where you're strongest in this fight. I think that's the way this fight is going to go, but Emeev definitely does have to be careful if he does take Zawada down and he's inside his guard, because we saw in Zawada's last fight he was potentially on the chopping block. He was 0-2 in the UFC, and then the UFC set him up with a fight against Abubakar Nurmagomedov in Russia, a fight that I think a lot of people expected Zawada to lose. Zawada gets taken down by Nurmagomedov, but then he whips up a triangle and submits Abubakar Nurmagomedov. So if that doesn't tell you that you've got to be careful if you're in Zawada's guard, I don't know what does. Ultimately, I think that Emeev is a veteran at this point, is savvy enough at this point to remain safe if he does take Zawada down. And if Zawada is threatening with submissions off his back, then I think Emeev could even just pass the guard and stay in half guard or go to side control or maybe even mount. But just getting out of guard is key in that scenario, and I think Emeev's got the capability to do that. I don't think Emeev is completely outgunned on the feet. I just think he will be a step behind. So I do think he will have to look for takedowns. The takedowns I think he'll get. I think he'll remain on top, get some good ground and pound, get some good top control time in, enough to win the rounds. I'm picking Ramazan Emeev to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Sarah Moras versus Vanessa Melo. Moras is currently the -230 favourite to come back on Melo at +190 as the underdog. Now, as for where the value is on this betting line, honestly, I don't think there's any value at all. I do understand why Moras is the favourite, but at -230, it's way too wide of a line to be playing for a UFC fighter with a negative MMA record at 6-7, who's only won 1 in the last 5 in the UFC. On the flip side, Melo +190, again 0-3 in the UFC, 10-8 overall. I just really don't see an angle on either side. As for where the betting line moves, I'm not anticipating it to move too much, if I'm being honest, because for the betting line to move, it means that action will be placed on the fight, and I just don't think that the masses are that interested in putting money on either side in this fight. If the betting lines do move, I do think it might get slightly closer to -200 for Moras. Obviously, that money coming back in on Melo at +190, but again, I don't anticipate it to move too much, so I think the fighters will go into the cage on Saturday night roughly where they're sitting right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I do think that Melo should be trying to keep this fight standing. She has got an all-round game. We've seen her look for takedowns, but I do think against Moras, she's at a disadvantage in the grappling department. On the feet, I think Melo will be able to have more success in this fight than what she would trying to grapple. And against Moras, you can get at it if you're overly aggressive and come forward and get in her face. But the problem that Melo's going to run to in this fight, if she tries to be aggressive and get in her face and really put it on Moras, I think Moras is just going to grab that body lock and look to trip her down to the mat, where if Moras gets on top, that's where her real path to victory is. And I think that's the reason why she's a -230 favourite in this fight, because with Moras, every single fight you can guarantee that she'll be looking to take that fight to the mat one way or another. And on top, she can be quite dangerous. I don't think Melo's got a great deal to offer off her back, so if Moras gets her down, I do think that she will be able to spend time on top of Melo. That'll give her opportunities to land some ground and pound and look for some submissions. And if Moras can get on top of Melo with a couple of minutes to work in a round, I do think that she might be able to find a finish. If she doesn't find a finish, then that round will probably end with Moras still on top, and then she'll come into the next round and probably look to replicate the same success as she had the round before. And that's the way I think the fight is going to go. I think at some point, Melo is going to get too close to Moras, she's going to get taken down, and I think Moras will be able to go to work on the mat. So that's the biggest path to victory in the fight. That's the biggest gap in skill, and for those reasons, I'm picking Sarah Moras to win this fight. And in the final fight of the breakdown, we've got a bit of a banger here in my opinion. We've got Jacob Kilburn versus Austin Lingo. Austin Lingo is currently the -225 favourite to come back on Kilburn at +185 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think it sits marginally with Austin Lingo, the favourite. I do think Lingo is dangerous in this fight, and I did expect the price to be around this sort of range, maybe even -250. That's why I'm saying there's marginal value on him. As for where the betting line moves, I do think if money is going to come on either side, I don't think it's going to be a massively action-placed fight, but if money does come in, I would anticipate it to be on Austin Lingo as opposed to Jacob Kilburn. I think that come Saturday night, we'll see the fighters go into the cage roughly where they're at right about now. And as for how this fight plays out, I think it's going to be a good fight. I think it's going to be a fight that predominantly takes place on the feet, is won and lost on the feet. But like I said at the start of the breakdown, I think it's going to be a low-key banger, this fight. I think both fighters are going to come out aggressive. Jacob Kilburn's got one-punch knockouts on his record. Austin Lingo's got brutal power and has knocked out multiple opponents on his record as well. So both fighters are going to feel that if they land one punch, that they're going to put their opponent out. And it's those types of fights that always make for really, really fun fights. It's just, for me, I feel like Austin Lingo could potentially be the faster fighter. I definitely think he's the more technical fighter. I think he's the more well-rounded fighter as well. So if Lingo decided to shoot a takedown, look to the wrestling and get on top, if things get a little too heated for him on the feet, then he's got the capability to do that. That gives him a plan B as well. But I think that Lingo is just the better fighter. I also think he hits harder than Kilburn. That makes him the more dangerous fighter too. So I feel that with multiple paths to victory, a plan A, a plan B, the fighter that I think is better technically technically the fighter that I feel hits the hardest is Austin Lingo, and for those reasons I'm picking Austin Lingo to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Money Line. We'll be back in a few days as we have that midweek Wednesday card. I hope you all enjoyed it, and once again I'd really appreciate all the likes and subscriptions to our MMAPlay365 YouTube channel as well. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAPlay365.com with our restructured and cheaper prices. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and as a long-term winning gambler over the last 4 years, that will likely come good for you. And we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot fun parlays, or ACCAs as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, and they're all at very affordable prices too. So just hop on to MMAPlay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.